The Lukens Method. What is it and how is it different? The Lukens Method right now is a way of approaching and providing services to individuals struggling with drug and alcohol problems, but also potentially with psychological conditions as we know them to be anxiety, depression, trauma. We are engaged in the practice of drug and alcohol treatment inside the program to be named, currently referred to as the Lukens Group. And so I'm going to gear this a little toward that because the initial clinicians that are coming in and the potential referring sources will be interested in drug and alcohol addiction. But I'm not going to limit the introduction to that alone. I'm going to include it, maybe place some emphasis on it. So the Lukens Method is something that we apply and have been applying to the problem of addiction and addiction treatment. Because of my understanding of human motivation, because of my theorizing about what makes people tick, the approach has been carefully crafted, put together with some consideration to consistency with the theory that gives rise to the understanding that I have about motivation, about the physics of emotioning. See the book. So understanding the potential client's pain even before they call. The method specifies a manner of classifying that or understanding that or explaining that or reaching out or recognizing the initial reaching out being initiated from either end is governed by the same laws of motivation and human interaction as everything else that we ever do. And at times, it may seem like I'm being far too careful, but what it is an effort to remain consistent, applying the theory, so the method has to represent the direct application of what the theory implies, what the theory specifies. And so, for instance, relative to the prospective client coming in, we have desire, we have interest, which overlaps with some considerations that other people have grappled with within other frameworks or models, like the stages of change model. According to Di Clemente and Prochaska, in the first stage of change, a person is not even thinking about it, talking about it, and in my terms, addiction, problem with addiction, the possibility of seeking recovery don't exist for the person, which is kind of hard to imagine, somebody being in this culture and doing a lot of drugs or alcohol and giving absolutely zero thought or consideration to the idea that they may have a problem or might develop a problem, and that then maybe they want to consider doing something to solve the problem. Because our culture talks too much about addiction for us to believe that somebody could be that naive. And I always found this sort of fascinating when they're looking to pick a jury in a celebrated case, that's been in the news for quite some time, that they actually find people that don't read the newspaper, have no idea what that case is about or what you're talking about. So, there's the contrast. On the one hand, it's hard to imagine people not having thoughts about it because everybody's talking about it, and then, of course, there's evidence that plenty of people don't have thoughts about stuff, don't know that stuff exists that everybody's talking about. So it takes all kinds, I guess. But so even there, while they have their model for it, I have my interpretation of what that means and what the elements, the important elements are that give shape to the model should we decide that the stages of change model has any validity. My model says to me why that would be the case or not the case. So you take the individual in the first stage who's not at all considered that they have a problem, and yet they live with people or interact with people, employers, family, etc., that may weigh in on that and think that they have a problem even when the person with the quote-unquote non-problem doesn't think they do. And then you see inside the drug and alcohol realm, they might refer to that as denial. Yeah, he definitely has a problem and he's in denial. Well, my theory doesn't traffic in those concepts that way. We have some interest or we have the absence of interest. And that's really the only binary dichotomy that matters up front. If there is no interest, if there's no attention being paid, if it doesn't really exist meaningfully for the person, then it doesn't exist. And later on, when I get to this part of the theory or the epistemology, the epistemological premises underlying the theory, I'll reconnect those dots. But if it doesn't exist in the meaningful world of the person, it doesn't exist for the person, so it doesn't exist, so they're not relating to it. And so it's kind of a non-issue. It doesn't really exist. In the blind spot, if you want to call it that from a different perspective, only darkness exists for the person. And yes, then it raises the questions, well, what if we brought flashlights and tried to shine some light on their blind spot? And of course that has to be discussed, and we'll get to that. All I'm suggesting here is that some of the frameworks that other people use that were not necessarily advanced by my theory, I try to understand their relevance and their potential validity based on this understanding coming from the theory. And if it fits, I keep it. If it needs some changing, I change it. If it doesn't fit, I discard it. And to develop the initial point further, from beginning to end in interacting with the human being, I'm trying to have myself and the people that work with me come from the consistent understanding and interpretation of what the theory would say about the issue at hand. So enrollment, beginning stages of seeking treatment, marketing, influence, interpersonal influence, the potential value of using interventions and interventionists, the effect of the culture on the mindset of people who are introduced to drugs and alcohol at an early age. All those things are relevant even prior to, for me to understand the phenomena of how addiction exists and or how the Lukens Method might help. All those things are taken into consideration based on the theory. And this is the beauty of the approach from my own personal standpoint, that it is a theory-guided, theory-driven process from top to bottom, from beginning to end. And therefore, despite its complexity, I'm going to argue that it lends itself to legitimate empirical investigation and potential validation. So the Lukens Method, from soup to nuts and interacting, in this case, really specifically with the person with drug and alcohol issues, is theory-based, theory-driven, and therefore there's a consistency. And therefore there's testability. Let's move a little more deeply right at this point into what I refer to as the meta-theory, the epistemological premises, the philosophy of science perspective that's underlying what I refer to as my theory of the physics of emotion. This is the conceptual platform upon which the interventions, the understanding about diagnostics, etc., emerge. They emerge from these sets of understandings. So one of the things to emphasize really early on in this discussion is the contrast between the constructivist worldview and the objectivist worldview, and to state rather flatly and clearly that I'm a constructivist through and through. And Of all the subcategories of constructivists, I think I'd label myself a radical constructivist, because there are different, subtle permutations of constructivism versus objectivism. And as they've been delineated out there, by others, I would identify myself as a radical constructivist, as would or as has Humberto Maturana, the developer of structural determinism, also been identified, self-identified and other identified. So the constructivist commitment, which is crucial, and I come back to it over and over and over again, really boils down to this in rather plain English. We don't live in the same independently observed and measurable and defined objective world. We each live in our own individual meaningful worlds that are generated by us individually in cooperation with each other. But I have my meaningful world, and I used my family, for instance, to make up a lot of that when I was younger, and my peers when I was younger, and now the culture, and even ideas passed on from antiquity that I get a chance to interact with. And so all the idea and the definitional soup that I live in, which involves the interactions with other living persons, but actually some non-living persons and just their ideas. It's from this soup that I create my meaningful world. And you're not in my soup. There's no soup that way, because my mother's not your mother. And in fact, my mother's not my brother's mother, because he had a different experience of her. And that's consistent with the constructivist assumptions. The world that I live in, I make up a conjunction with my interaction with others and their ideas, but in the end, I piece it together myself